Hello, welcome to Education TV. And in our first episode, we have a look at feedback to students. We'll have a very detailed look at pupil premium with an interview with John Dunford. And we'll also be looking at values-based education. But first of all, I'm joined by Tim Bartlett, who is a chair of governors and also former head teacher. Welcome, Tim. A few things happening in the news at the moment which I think are worthy of comment. The first thing is this move back to linear exams effectively. And maybe I'm wrong, but I thought 20 or so years ago we decided this was the worst idea in the world and we should never do it again.
And it's going to be a challenge for teachers to make the most of it for the students in the school. I'm confident we'll manage it. We always do. It'll be a matter of teachers focusing on the building up the skills of the children and young people so that whatever happens then, the exam is just part of what they do. It's just one of the things they take in their stride. After all, for these students, they will have known nothing else. This will be it for them, so it'll work.
Well, you say that the students will know nothing else, but actually many of our teachers watching this now will actually have themselves qualified through the GCSE system, will have no recollection of O-levels and CSEs, and so there is a real danger that actually nobody's left almost who knows how this sort of thing should work.
And it's true, and I have to say one of the reasons why teaching has been so challenging the last 30 years is there have been these continuous changes in the way in which our children and young people are assessed in schools. And you're quite right, you put your finger right on it. This is the time when almost nobody teaching now can remember linear exams. So it's going to be a real challenge. There'll have to be a lot of training. There'll be, obviously, teachers get together and talk to each other about how to do it. And I imagine parents, of course, some of them will welcome it because they'll say, I recognise this is how it was for me. Not all of them, of course, will have good memories.
Yes.
They will remember spending 2 years doing a GCSE or an O-level course and then failing it.
Because it's all focused on that final stage.
I'm afraid it looks like that's what we're going back to.
Okay. But I was interested, you mentioned there the idea of it still being skills-based. Is that possible, or does it have to be rote learning?
Well, it's going to be skills for life. The teachers will always teach to the exam. If that requires a lot of rote learning, then that's exactly what you'll see happening in every school in the country. But all good education is about the skills the children, the young people, take forward to the next stage of their lives. Things change all the time. Whatever professional field you're in, people have to keep up to date.
And what was wrong with what we've already got? What was wrong with the GCSE structure? What are they trying to solve with this change?
I'm not at all confident that the government has been clear about what exactly was wrong with GCSEs. There was an anxiety that standards were falling, but that was disguised by the system learning how to make the most of the exam system. But the evidence about standards falling is very scant. Under a previous administration, examination boards had to run 10-year samples so that we could measure whether 10 years ago standards were lower or higher. That's no longer happening. So the evidence that standards have fallen while exam results have gone up is thin.
And we're talking a lot about the history of teaching. Very much at the forefront these days is a new invention, the idea of free schools. And yet they don't seem to be going desperately well if all you look at is media reports. The idea seems to be that people are leaving, head teachers are leaving, teachers aren't comfortable with it. We've had these dreadful problems, it would appear, in Derby with the school there. Many media outlets reporting disasters in free schools. Is it a complete disaster?
No, it isn't. The problem we have, and it's similar to the exam issue, is that this is children's one time through the system. So it has to be as nearly right as possible for as much of the time as possible. So start anything new, and there's going to be a tension and conflict between trying something new, but making sure that for the children for whom it's their only time through the system, it is at least as good as what they would have done if they hadn't embarked on the new system itself. So the turnover of staff isn't surprising because free schools are new. So there is studio schools are new. UTCs, the University Technology Colleges, are new. So that there isn't an apprenticeship. So somebody might start working in one and find, actually, this isn't for me. Somebody may become a head teacher and realise, actually, this isn't what I've spent my career working my way towards. I haven't got the skill set needed. So it doesn't surprise me that at the beginning that there's some turnover. What we need to focus on is the experience of the children and young people through the system. If that is affecting it badly, we need to take steps.
And do you think the rest of the education establishment is helping the free schools enough?
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, teaching, like all professions, has a collegiality to it. There's always been a contact between the fully independent sector and the state sector. Very often people's partners worked in one or the other. And I would imagine at that level, practitioner level, teachers will be talking to each other because we know what it's like. We stand in a classroom, we've got 30 children in front of us. It doesn't matter whether it's a free school or whether it's Stowe, one of the big public schools, and it doesn't matter whether it's a tiny primary school. It's the same experience. So teachers will be helping each other to make the most of it for the children in front of them.
Okay. And for our viewers who are in free schools, perhaps what would our one tip be, or what would your one tip be to them?
I think contact others. I mean, unfortunately, they're quite widespread at the moment, but that's our familiar way. There must be something distinctive about the experience in a free school. So to begin with, they should be using the social media, using whatever media we can to get in touch with each other. How is it going for you? What works, what doesn't? Important to ask what isn't working.
Okay. And one final point I wanted to discuss with you is the idea of perhaps a job for you, actually, Tim. Regional commissioners, we hear that they're going to be coming in the very near future. I guess, first of all, what will they be doing?
The big change is that we're moving away from local education authorities. We've been moving away from that now for over 20 years, which were locally elected councillors responsible for the quality and provision of education in their areas. You have to have something between national government and the schools. This, is the middle tier, and the government's proposal is to replace locally elected people with regionally appointed commissioners who have responsibility for the quality of education in their areas. And I think what practitioners need to do is to ask the question, this will be the key question, where will we go for the support we need when things are not going as well as we would wish them to be going in our school? That's the key question. And that's one, while we're setting the system up, that I, as a teacher, would want to know the answer to. I'd want to know it if I was a member of the support staff. I'd want to know it if I were a governor. Where do we go when things aren't as good as they could be? And
of course, the support from local education authorities has been falling over the years. So this is needed really quite quickly, I would suspect.
It is. There's no doubt we're in a risky position at the moment where we're moving from one system to the other. If you like, we're stepping off one lily pad on a pond and we haven't quite got our foot on the next one. And there's always a risk at that point. I don't think anybody would believe that we're not at a point where a school hasn't actually at the moment got the range of support that the school had 5 years ago. There are no longer subject specialists available to them. There aren't any modern languages advisors who could come in and give advice to a school about modern languages employed by the local authority. We'll have to see. So we're in that gap at the moment. We've demolished one system. We haven't yet put in place the next.
And it seems that we're actually going in two different directions at the same time. With free schools, with academies, we seem to be moving to a much more autonomous unit for schools where they seem to be able to look after themselves. And yet we have centralisation of the tier above that. Am I missing something, or is that going in two directions?
What we have to hope, Giles, is that there's a creative tension. What it may be a sleight of hand, that actually saying that, referring to things like local authority control of schools, and that we're removing that, I suspect what we're going to end up with is a different sort of control of schools.
Tim, for now, thank you very much. Now it's time for a tip, which this episode, it comes from John Beasley, who will be talking about evidencing progress through feedback.
If there's one thing we're all going to experience at one time or another, it's an Ofsted inspector being in our lessons. And they'll only be in there for about 20 minutes. So how can you prove to an Ofsted inspector, or indeed anybody else who's coming in to observe your lessons, that the kids are making progress over time in your subject? One of the best ways to do this is through effective feedback. I've got a couple of techniques that might help you with this. One is to say to the kids, right, what we're going to have today is a piece of work where I'm going to give you really good feedback and I want you to respond to it. Now, this is what I call imperative feedback. It's where you're actually making sure that the kids make a response. A good technique for doing this is to say, in this piece of work, I want you to write on alternate lines. I'll then take in the work, give you the feedback, and I'll then make sure that you are making the responses by you writing in the blank lines between your original work in a different coloured pen your response to my feedback. If you do this, and you do this on a regular basis, then you can just see by flicking through the books that the kids are responding to your feedback and, hopefully, are making progress as a result of it. When they do make the progress, what you need to make sure is that your feedback is then developing them further so that you're not still getting the kids to work on the same things that they've now cracked. You then move them on to some other aspect that you want to concentrate on. Another technique that I've seen work really well with feedback and evidence in progress is to put the work that the kids do first on the wall, and then behind that have their second draft. I went into a classroom and I looked at the work that was on display. When I saw it, I thought, actually, this doesn't look too good. But there was all the feedback. And then on a second page, hidden behind the first, was the redrafted work where the kids had responded to the feedback that was given and made improvements. It was an excellent way of showing that the kids were responding to feedback and making progress as a result. Another useful thing is what I call dishing the dirt. This is dedicated improvement and reflection time, where sometimes in a sequence of lessons you say, okay, we're going to give half an hour over to you looking at the feedback which I've been giving over the last few lessons, and making sure that you sit down now and you dedicate this time to reflecting on what's really worked well for you and then improving the work further. I want you to actually write down what strategies worked for you, what strategies you think you still need to improve on. If you can do this and do this on a regular basis, then you'll be able to evidence this progress over time. Another strategy that I've seen work really well is at the end of the piece of work, put WWW. That is what went well. And then EBI, even better if, but then crucially after that, do the MRI. My response is. Make sure then that the pupils respond to your suggestions about the content of the work, but also get them to respond about the skills that they may have learned in that lesson or sequence of lessons, and also strategies that they've learned that they can then take forward as well. If you can get them to do that, then you'll more easily evidence progress over time.
We're now joined by Mrs. Katie Joyner, who is the head of juniors at Quinton House School, a co-educational independent school in Northampton. Thank you for joining us. And you're here to talk about something I know you're very passionate about, which is values-based education. And perhaps you should start off by telling us, what is it?
Values-based education is a holistic school approach, basically looking at the values that parents and teachers want their children to espouse and to live with, both in school and outside of school. Okay.
And it covers, as you say, it's a holistic approach, so it literally covers everything you do?
It does affect everything we do, and it involves everybody in the school. So from our kitchen staff, our maintenance staff, our teachers, our TAs, everybody in the school buys into our values education and is part of that. We celebrate a different value every month. The values are displayed around the school and in every part of the school. And if you go into our kitchen, if you come and visit our school and go into the kitchen, the values are all up, and kitchen staff will praise children and thank children for demonstrating those values, and indeed, if they don't show those values, we'll point to the values that they should have shown and explain why they didn't.
Okay. So, I mean, I know that there are now over 2,000 schools in the UK that have signed up to this and are following this holistic approach. How did you get involved in it in the first place?
I got involved as a newly qualified teacher. I was asked to go on a course. To be totally honest with you, I didn't really know what the course was about. But I was very fortunate to be spoken to by Neil Hawkes, who championed values education from the early days. And I was really inspired by what he had to say. And as my teaching career progressed and I became more able to influence other teachers around me, I then gradually built it into the schools that I was working at.
Perhaps you could talk us through, in an average day, where do we see these things happening, both in and outside of the classroom?
So on an average day, as soon as the children walk into the school, there's a big display board up with our values. They have that taught to them through PSHE lessons. We have a weekly assembly where classes take it in turns to lead on the current value. So a value will last about a month and then we'll move on to the next one. Having said that, we don't forget about the previous value, but we have a focus. So through PSHE lessons, through assemblies, through teachers spotting children displaying those values, through children spotting each other displaying those values, and those values are then nominated. Children nominate each other at assemblies, and parents get involved as well and nominate their children and let us know what they've been doing to show those values at home, which is fabulous.
Okay, and you would then recognise that within the school. So if a parent said to you, this particular value, I've spotted this, they would tell you about it, and how would you then recognise that?
Yes, I mean that works really well for us actually, because we have bricks, not real bricks but paper bricks, and we send home a sheet of bricks about once a term, and parents then fill in the brick as to what their child has done, send them in, and we then at our assembly, those children come up to the front, we talk about what they've done at home, and then the bricks are added to our values wall, and we've got a wonderful display wall which has built up all those fabulous values those children are showing.
And we keep talking about values. Perhaps we should actually say what some of them are. I know there are quite a few of them, but what's this month's value, for example?
So at the moment we're talking about courage. Last month was respect. We think about love, patience, humility, cooperation. We have 20 values in all. And the values were actually decided by the parents themselves. So that's lovely because it means as a whole school community, that's another way of showing that everybody's bought into it.
And I think, because you actually introduced it to the school, I think that's right, isn't it? So talk us through that process. You turned up at the school and said, this is what I'd like to do. And what happened next?
Well, change is never easy, is it, Giles? So, you turn up and you want to introduce something new. And first of all, I think you have to show that you've done it before and that it works. So I was able to talk about my previous experiences and why I wanted to introduce it. And staff were very, very quickly got on board, which was great. I think it's important to say that, I didn't turn up to a school where I'd got a lot of behaviour problems. I turned up to a school where I've got a lot of very polite, very happy, very settled children with, other than the normal niggles, there was nothing to be concerned about. And that's not why I wanted to bring it in. I wanted to bring it in because it's such an important thing. They're such important life skills. So going back to your previous question about how then did I introduce it, once I'd got staff on board, I then talked to children about the sorts of things we wanted to do. And then I invited parents in for an information evening. And I asked them to tell me what values they wanted their children to espouse, both in school and outside of school, and also the sort of human beings that they wanted them to be when they left. And from that, we drew up the list of the 20 values that we now currently have, and we run them on a month-by-month basis.
And is this something that, obviously, you talked about it in the kitchen, you talk about it in the main sort of passageways of the school. What about in the classrooms? How does it form part of the core curriculum, if you like?
It's the vocabulary that's used everywhere that you go. So for just an example, if someone's done a good piece of work and they want to share it and they're reading it out, and then the teacher might comment on the fact that everybody's listened really well, but instead of just saying you listened really well, they would say thank you for showing so-and-so respect, while you listen to them share their piece of work. So at every opportunity, we use the language of values so that the children would see it being used and can understand it in a very practical, hands-on way.
And how have colleagues who've been at the school for perhaps a lot longer, how do they feel it's changed the school? And do they still sign up to it as much as they did on day one?
Yes, they certainly do. I mean, it's like with every initiative. There's person who spearheads it has to keep going, because it's very easy to start something with a load of passion and then for things to die away. So I would say that I do need to keep on, and I do send out my every month a newsletter to the staff saying, right, next value is, and this is what we're going to focus on. So I do drive it forward, and I have to drive it forward all the time. But staff can see the difference that it makes with the children. Staff really enjoy, when we have our assemblies, being able to celebrate the achievements of the children from a values point of view. And the general feel that it brings. It gives us all a unity, it binds us together.
And it was interesting when I was looking at Neil Hawkes' website, it was very interesting to see that in some much larger schools than yours, there are situations where there is a member of staff actually tasked with just looking after the value side of things. It isn't the role of the head teacher.
No, and that's something that I would like to develop, to be honest. I'd like to build a values team and hand that over to somebody else to take on, because I think that's always a sign of when something's really embedded, when other people feel that they can run with it. And I think we're nearly there, but we're not quite.
So if you were offering the advice to colleagues around the country, you would say, just go for this 100%, but appreciate that there's some work attached to it.
There definitely is some work attached to it, and if you believe in it, then it's certainly worth doing, because the difference that I've seen in the schools that I've worked in is really worth it.
Okay. And one final question, which is, obviously we operate in a very structured world and a very structured profession these days in terms of reporting and information that has to be handed into government and what have you. And also, of course, Ofsted reports are looking for very specific things. How on earth can something so touchy-feely as values, how can that possibly sit within this structured idea of an Ofsted report and the expectations of government these days?
Yes, so that's always an interesting one. But at the end of the day, the touchy-feeliness goes through into everything that the children do, and therefore the children are allowed to learn, are allowed to be proud, are allowed to persevere, are allowed to show courage and be proud of those things. And I think it gives our children the freedom to be able to do that, and therefore the freedom and the happiness leads to positive results. And Ofsted are not going to moan about that.
Okay. Casey, thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
We now rejoin Tim Bartlett, who is going to give us a tip on governance.
For almost all full governing body meetings, it's the head teacher's report which is the centrepiece. And I'll use the word head teacher irrespective of whether you have a principal or an executive principal. The head teacher's report is there central to the full governing body's meeting. So these tips are about how to make the very most of something which has taken a long time to prepare and which your lead professional, the highest paid person on the staff, is presenting to you. Very often, the head teacher will talk to the report and then one or two questions. This isn't making the most of it at all. What I suggest you do, one technique that really works, is to allow the governors time to look over the report, and I do this in pairs. The reason for this is that governors are busy too. They may well have wished to have spent plenty of time reading it and using a highlighter or marking it up in pencil, but they may not have done. You may have newly arrived governors for whom this is their first, second or perhaps third meeting and not quite yet found their feet. Set them up in pairs or trios. Give them no more than 5 minutes to look through the report again, to look at any areas they want to comment on or ask questions about. At 4 minutes, give them 1 minute warning and say something like, you've got 1 more minute. Between the two of you or the three of you, select one question or one comment that you're going to want to use when I invite you to. Then it's simply a matter of going around the table, asking each pair or trio to raise the comment or to make the question that they want to ask the head clear so that everybody gets an answer. Now you can see, I think, just from that technique that you're going to get a lot more engagement, you're going to get governors feeling a lot more confident, your new governors will feel that they've got some help in coming to terms with technical language. 2 tips really are 2 questions to ask. I've seen lots of reports from staff, from head teachers and from senior staff that spell out an awful lot of things that have happened. So they're high on that, but very low on, has it worked? Has it done what we wanted it to do? I wonder if your last head teacher's report had a whole long list of all the things that have happened in the school in the last month. Probably some wonderful things. And the question governors need to ask is, has it made a contribution? What is the contribution this has made to our children and young people's learning? It's a simple thing to ask. In other words, the 2 questions always in our minds are this. Did it happen as planned? And the answer should be relatively brief, it's either yes or no. And if no, a little explanation about why it was different. And did it have the impact that we wanted it to have. We use the word impact a lot, don't we, in education? And I'm just going to decode that one for you. Ask about benefit. I see that we had a wonderful school production. I'm so glad it went well. Where was the benefit? Who benefited from what we did? And you'll find that the teachers in front of you, the head, if it's the head, will immediately be able to say, oh, of course, it made a great contribution in this or that way. So there's 3 things then to think about. Using the head teacher's report by giving governors time to review it and to prepare questions and comments. And 2 questions that should always be in your mind. Did it happen as planned? And what was the impact? Did it work as intended?
For our interview, I'm joined by Dr John Dunford, who is the Pupil Premium Champion. He's also a former secondary head and was General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Dr Dunford, welcome. Pupil Premium is obviously a hugely important topic, and I'm going to cut to the chase. £1.8 billion, more money next year. Would this not be better just put in the pot and shared out with all schools?
Well, in fact, it's going up to £2.5 billion next year, £1,300 per pupil premium eligible pupil in primary schools, £935 in secondary schools in the next financial year. And £2.5 billion is a very, very substantial sum of money. And the reason that the government's put this money into schools in this way is because there's a very high priority placed particularly by Nick Clegg and as Deputy Prime Minister, and by David Laws, the Schools Minister, but by Michael Gove and the Education Department. A real priority being placed on schools closing the gap. Because the gap between the achievements of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds in this country and more advantaged ones is much, much wider than it is in other countries. And it really is time we did something about this as a society. And what the government is saying is, this is a priority for us, and we want you, the schools, to spend this money in a way that will help pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to do better.
And you talk about using that money in the right place effectively and using it to improve the performance of these individuals. But there are various sort of stories and rumours out there that in fact this money is used to support other parts of the budget which are lacking. How can we be sure that the money is actually being used in the right places?
Well, first of all, any well-run school will have a really good audit trail for this money, from the point at which they receive the money, through how they have made the decision on what to spend it on, through to the way in which they've introduced the strategy, how they have monitored the success of that strategy with the pupil premium money, and then, crucially, what the impact of it is. And the great difference about pupil premium, and one of the reasons that I'm pleased to be involved with this, is we've spent the last 25 years as a profession being told in detail what to do by the government. And it's kind of deprofessionalised us, I think, in some ways. What's happening with the pupil premium money is that the government is saying to us, social mobility is a priority. We know that schools can't completely solve it, but we want schools to make a contribution to increasing social mobility in this country, and in particular we want you to close the gap between the achievement of the disadvantaged young people and others. And we're not going to tell you how to do it. Now that's a big change from the last 25 years. We're not going to tell you how to do it. We're not going to hold you to account for how you spend this money, but we are going to hold you to account for the impact that you make with it. And what schools are obliged to do, and they're obliged to report this on their websites, is to say at the beginning of the year what their plans are, and at the end of the year how they spent that money, what they've spent it on, and what the impact has been, how they can show that pupil premium eligible youngsters have made faster progress than others, for example, during the course of the year.
That could have a huge morale boost to the profession as a whole.
Oh, I think if schools can use this money successfully, it will be a huge morale boost because the leaders of the profession, and in that I include governing bodies, and it's absolutely critical that school leaders involve governing bodies and their staff as well in the decisions that they make around the spending of the pupil premium money. They really do have a great deal of autonomy in the way in which this money is spent. And I've come across a primary school in the northwest of England that has spent all of this money on one strategy. They have halved class size. And they can demonstrate that as a result of doing that, they have made some impact. Now, there's a lot of evidence about reducing class size which says that spending money on reducing class size is a complete waste of money. And that is true if you reduce class size by just 3 or 4. But if you take a dramatic step like that, then you can make a difference with it. At the other end of the scale, I came across a primary school down in the southeast of England that was able to itemise the 23 different strategies that it was using with pupil premium money. And it could say, we're spending £2,000 on this and £545 on that and so on. And I think the difference there is that the school in the northwest that's just used one strategy has made an overall, if you like, a macro policy decision about what's right, what's going to work best in their school. The school in the southeast that's using the 23 different strategies has started with the individual pupils, looked at the needs of the individual pupils and worked up from there. Two completely different approaches, both of them legitimate, but under the way in which the government is running the pupil premium policy, it's all about impact. And those schools will both be able to show that they have made an impact with what they've done, because they've made a good, well thought through decision in each case about how to spend the money.
Okay. Now, both schools you mentioned, they were primary schools.
Yes.
And there is a school of thought that actually by the time a child has got through probably year 7 or year 8, then pupil premium isn't really going to have an impact. Is there an argument that actually the money should be entirely spent on primary education?
Well, the government is next financial year raising the £900 per pupil to £1,300 per pupil in primary schools and to £935 per pupil in secondary schools. A real term increase, but nothing like the increase that primary schools are getting. And that is precisely a recognition that the more you can do earlier on, the better. But the reason we need to go on spending money on pupil premium in secondary schools is that the gap grows between age 11 and age 16. Just to give you some statistics, at age 11 there is a gap of 16% between the percentage of free school meals youngsters who get level 4 and others. That gap grows to 26% by the age of 16, with the proportion of youngsters on free school meals and others who get 5 GCSEs at A to C with English and maths. So it's growing from 16% to 26%, and that's on average across the country. The growth in individual schools and individual local authorities can be much bigger than that. So there really is something happening in secondary schools, which means that disadvantaged pupils are falling back relative to the others. And secondary schools have got to put the money into doing something about that.
As well as there being evidence that this is a problem, is there evidence of how we can solve those problems?
There is, and I think there's probably more evidence in this area than there is in a lot of other areas. I think the teaching profession has never been as good at using evidence as, let's say, the medical profession. You would not go to a doctor who didn't read the Lancet every month and keep absolutely bang up to date with the latest medical science. Whereas a good teacher of history might have been doing it pretty much the same way for a generation. So what has happened with the pupil premium is that there are basically 3 routes that I hope people will use when they are looking at the evidence of what works. The first route is to get out there and have a look at what schools that have been successful in their use of the pupil premium, successful in closing the gap, what have they been doing? How have they done it? And bring that knowledge back into your own school and adapt it to the context of your particular situation. So that's the first thing, using good practice, excellent practice from elsewhere. The second and most important bit of evidence is what we used to call the Sutton Trust toolkit, and we call it the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit. There's 33 different strategies on there, and it's very, very easy to use. You just go into Google, Education Endowment Foundation toolkit, and up will pop on the screen these 33 strategies, showing you which ones are the most effective and how much they cost. And then what you've got to do is make a decision in the context of your school, balancing effectiveness against cost. You're certainly not going to use any of the low effective strategies, but you probably are going to look at the more effective strategies and think about how much you want to spend on them. And if you spend twice as much on that strategy, are you going to be able to do? Could you otherwise do those two strategies? And these, it's very clear, and you can click on any one of those 33 strategies and you go in behind it and you'll be told how to do that properly. What's interesting is when that toolkit first came out, teaching assistants got a very bad press, because the toolkit will tell you that spending extra money on teaching assistants, very expensive way to spend the pupil premium money, makes zero difference. Whereas other strategies as much as plus 8 months, 20 months progress for the youngsters instead of 12. Teaching assistant, 0. What that actually means is, because the 0 is an average, what that means is that some schools use teaching assistants so badly that it actually holds the pupils back, whereas some schools use teaching assistants extremely well and would still want to go on using some pupil premium money to do that. And I think the difference, crucially, is training. And I think the most important part of using teaching assistants effectively is training the teachers in the use of the teaching assistants. There's got to be training in depth. And I'm not just talking about an hour at a staff meeting. I'm talking about potentially 2 days of training to make sure that people use the strategy really, really effectively. And there are lessons in this in the third bit of evidence that I wanted to mention, which is from Ofsted. 2 very useful Ofsted reports on the pupil premium, one in September 2012, and the one that I particularly want people to read, which is the February 13 Ofsted report on the pupil premium, where it's very easy to use. There is a list there of successful approaches in schools that have been successful in closing the gap. And there is a list of unsuccessful approaches of schools that have been unsuccessful in closing the gap. And Ofsted went out and did this themed inspection across a range of schools, came back, drew this evidence together, and there's 2 very simple, very straightforward lists of things to do and things not to do. And of course, some are just the obverse of the other. I mean, on the first list, it's involve your governing body. In the decisions on the second list, it's the governing body was not involved. Right. On the first list, it's create a really good audit trail for the spending of the money. On the second list, it's people just put the money in the budget and don't really know what happened to it, and so on.
And you mentioned Ofsted and the work they've already done. Yes. Ofsted really have been told to put this at the top of their list, haven't they? The use of pupil premium money.
Oh, there's no question that the way in which the government is hoping to ensure that schools use this money successfully is not by telling them how to do it, because they're not doing that. They're letting schools make the decision about the strategies. It's through accountability. And Ofsted is it's a very important part of the Ofsted accountability regime now, is the way in which you are closing the gap, the way in which you are using the pupil premium effectively. For example, schools that have good exam results on the face of it, been doing really well, got outstanding in their last 1 or 2 inspections, if they are not doing well with the pupil premium youngsters, if they are not showing that they're making really good progress and that they are closing the gap, those schools will no longer be graded outstanding. So it's a serious issue for the schools. But I think what the government is focusing on now more with the new accountability measures, and Ofsted is starting to focus on more, is the progress that young people are making, the progress that children are making. And I think that is where you can monitor the impact of the pupil premium expenditure on a regular basis most easily. So I think schools need to concentrate on being able to monitor the progress children make, on having really high quality data that they can subdivide into pupil premium youngsters and others, so that they can show that they are closing the gap in terms of the pupil premium youngsters making faster progress than others.
If you close the gap, to use this phrase that keeps cropping up, then are you not simply making everybody closer to an average point? You're not allowing the people who happen to be from a different background achieve their goals perhaps as easily.
No, I mean, this is about raising achievement as well as closing the gap. And if I say to, as I do when I'm speaking to head teacher conferences, what are your top 2 priorities as a head teacher? They will almost invariably say raising achievement and closing the gap. If I say to Michael Gove, what are your top 2 priorities for education policy? He would say raising achievement and closing the gap. And I actually did ask that question of Ed Balls when he was Secretary of State, and he said exactly the same thing. So whatever head teachers and teachers might think of government education policy, the fact of the matter is we're all on the same side in terms of the essentials of raising achievement and closing the gap. The point of the pupil premium policy is that we want to raise achievement for the pupil premium eligible youngsters faster than for others, to try to overcome this quite shocking gap that we've got in this country between the achievements of poorer people and others, which does not exist to anything like the same extent in other countries.
2 questions going back to funding and the idea of free school meals as the calculation point, if you like. Question 1, quite simply, is that, in your opinion, is that the right model to use? And question 2, if plans do go ahead to introduce free school meals for everybody within the next 2 to 3 years, then how on earth will you calculate it then?
There's a problem in getting a really good measure of deprivation, and there are a number of different measures of deprivation, and I've never been particularly happy with the free school meals measure of deprivation, but it's the one we've got, and it may not be precisely correct, but it covers certainly pupil premium eligibility. Free school meals eligibility covers the vast majority of children here. So vast majority of children. So I think I'm not going to argue with it as being useful. When we get to all children in the first 3 years of primary school having free school meals, then clearly the government has to look at a different way of allocating pupil premium money, at least to primary schools, and they are looking at that at the moment. It won't affect the next financial year because, of course, the numbers are always based on the numbers at the previous January. So the following financial year, that will still be okay. It'll still be based on information that we know. The year after that, by that time, I'm sure the government will have looked at a way in which they can work this out fairly. It may well be around some other measure of deprivation. It may be around eligibility for free school meals rather than take-up of free school meals. But we'll just have to see. I'm speculating. I don't have any inside information on that.
Okay. And there is, the government have come out and said there's no real link between funding and achievement.
Yeah.
With that in mind, you have to question the whole point of the pupil premium, don't you?
There's a big debate internationally about funding, and if you look at a league table of how much countries spend on education and schools, and how well the young people do in those schools, I agree with you. There isn't a direct correlation. It's not we'll spend more, therefore we will get better results. But funding is a way in which governments can determine policy and can influence direction. The 2 really strong drivers, if you like, that governments have of policy are funding and accountability. And we still don't have a fair funding system in this country. They're taken far too long to try to devise a fair funding system in this country. But separate from that, the government is saying, actually, social mobility is so important to us that we are prepared to put next year £2.5 billion extra into schools to help them to do extra things for disadvantaged youngsters. And I think that's really good. And I think schools should just grab the opportunity with both hands and make sure they make a success of it.
You talk there about different countries and the funding they receive. But of course, within England, we have very different levels of funding in individual authorities. First of all, can it be right that a child in central London gets the same £900 as a child in the northwest? But also, can it be right that some local authorities, even with pupil premium, will get nowhere near the amount per pupil that other authorities are getting as a starting point?
The whole issue of funding is extremely complex, and I do think there are examples in recent government policy of ways in which funding has been used really effectively in an area to drive up educational achievement. And the best example of this, of course, is the London Challenge, which is now London schools are much better funded, and there's very good reasons for that, which I'm sure people understand. Whether the difference is exactly right or not, we shall see when we get a new fair funding formula. But I think the London Challenge is a good example of how you can spend money and make an effect. And there is no question that London has moved from being, 10 years ago, the worst performing region in the country, and now it's the best performing region. And the reason for that is the government put extra money into London and created a situation in which schools began to help schools. Schools began to support schools. Schools began to look at the evidence of what works. And a huge amount of responsibility was placed on the school leaders to lead not only their own school, but to lead their local system forward. And I think the lessons from that can be drawn in the way in which you implement pupil premium in your school, the way in which you go and find out what excellent practice is happening elsewhere, the way in which you draw on the evidence in the toolkit, and the way in which you look at Ofsted reports. Those three evidence strategies that I mentioned.
So when you were saying the idea of using leadership from elsewhere, obviously, if a school underperforms using pupil premium, they are obliged, as I understand it, to look for outstanding leadership elsewhere to come in and guide. Are you saying that actually they shouldn't wait until they've been told they're not doing very well? They should make that phone call straight away?
Yes, if a school is deemed to be requiring improvement under an Ofsted inspection, and if it's doing badly on closing the gap, then they will have to get advice from elsewhere. This advice is available in a number of different ways, but the best thing for a school to do in those circumstances is to go onto the National College website, where there is a list of national leaders of education and local leaders of education who have implemented the pupil premium successfully, who are closing the gap in their schools. And you can literally put your postcode in and a list of people comes up. And my message to schools is don't wait until you get a requiring improvement to click onto that list and find out where these national leaders of education are in your area, pick up the telephone, get in touch with them and get them to come in and give you some advice.
Okay, and we'll put that information, that website on the screen so you can have a look at it yourselves. We talked about free school meals an awful lot, and obviously that's the thing that receives the main publicity and the main highlights. But there are two other groups as well who it would be wrong not to include them. The children of service personnel, yes, of course, receive an amount of money. I don't think they get quite as much.
No, less money.
And then the third group is children who are cared for by the state for the last 6 months, I think.
Looked after children the amount for looked after children is going up to £1,900 per pupil. And this is likely to come to schools through the virtual school head, whose responsibility in each local authority is for the progress of looked after children. It's a coordinating role, coordinating head teacher role for all the looked after children. The looked after children have had a really raw deal. They're very, very rapidly moved around between different schools. They often go to many different schools, living in many different home situations and so on. And their educational performance, their opportunity, if you like, to make something of their lives has statistically been terribly bad in this country. And the government is saying, by giving this extra money, is saying to schools, you really do have to make these people a priority. And the thing is, schools may only have 2 or 3 of them, or 10 or something, but that may only be a couple in each year group. And you just must not let these young people get lost in the system. It's really important that you give them every opportunity to make the most of the talents they have. And that may well mean spending some extra money on them.
As part of that programme, perhaps some work with the carers of those young people as well would be important.
Yes, I mean that kind of comes under the same category as working with parents to raise their aspirations of what the children can do. And it's interesting, the Education Endowment Foundation uses some of its money to fund research projects to see what works best. And one of the projects I think is going to be particularly interesting is where they are paying parents to come into school, come to parents' evenings and things like that. It'll be very interesting to see how that goes. Because all head teachers, all school leaders and teachers know that there are some parents it's much more difficult to get into school than others. Some parents it's much more difficult to engage actively with the education of their children. And those tend to be the parents of pupil premium eligible youngsters. So spending some money on that you can show directly, I think, impact, faster progress, greater impact.
And you mentioned earlier on the idea of training the staff, whether it be as teaching assistants, teachers, all the way through. Presumably that would be part of the training that was ongoing. This isn't going to eat up the pupil premium money itself.
Of the 33 strategies on the toolkit, the one at the very top is feedback. And that's something, and it's about good teaching, good quality teaching. And if you look down the 33 strategies, quite a few of those are about good quality teaching. But giving good feedback to youngsters is actually not about just teachers, is it? It's also about school support staff. It's about the way in which the adults in the school community interact with the young people in a way which helps them to understand their learning better and helps them to learn more. And that's not just about training the teachers, it's about training the whole staff in how you give better feedback to young people. It's just one example.
Dr Dunford, thank you very much indeed. Well, that concludes our first episode of Education TV. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the email on screen now, educationtv@ar-media.co.uk. But for this episode, bye-bye.